Research Alternatives. I welcome you all to this distinguished session. The Society for Research Alternatives, SFRA, is an interdisciplinary research organization. This is located at Siuri, Birbhum, West Bengal. The motto of our organization lies in the need for promoting interdisciplinary research and exploring tools for connecting communities embedded in a wider passion for upholding social justice and the empowerment of the marginalized. Our team comprises of a wave of progressive young minds engaged in critical thinking. Our focus also lies on pedagogy and social services who are spurred by their need to develop an alternative perspective of knowledge production. This evening marks another episode of our journey. Today we have with us Kumar Das, Assistant Professor of English, Presidency University. Professor Das has done his undergraduate and postgraduate in English studies respectively from Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandir, Belur Math, and Jadavpur University. He has recently finished his PhD on Bengali Dalit writing, jointly from Jadavpur University and Center for Studies in Social Science, Kolkata. Since 2012, he has been teaching at the Department of English, Presidency University. In 2017, he was a visiting fellow at the Center for Dalit Studies, Department of English, Delhi University. He is currently a guest faculty at the Department of Comparative Indian Language and Literature, University of Calcutta. His research interest lies in Dalit studies, Subaltern Studies, critical literary theory, political philosophy. His research articles are published in reputed research journals like Critical Philosophy of Race, Dewey Studies, EPW, Bangla Journal, Contemporary Voice of Dalit. His paper titled Subaltern Historiography to Dalit Historiography, Tracing Heterogeneity in Dalit Subalternity, which was published in EPW in 2015, has become a part of academic curriculum of history, master's program in history at the University of Warwick. We are grateful to you, sir, for accepting our invitation. Today, he will be talking on the history of Dalit literature in Bengal. Without further ado, I would request Professor Das to take over the virtual platform. And thank you once again, sir, for joining us today. Thank you all. You can start. The virtual floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Shagato. I hope I'm properly audible. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Perfectly.
Okay, great. Thanks to Toshali and Shagato and others who have arranged this particular lecture, organized this lecture, this event. I'm particularly happy about the fact that this has been a prestigious series of lectures. And I was just taking a quick look at the previous list of speakers, the list of previous speakers, and most of them are extremely important scholars, either in my field or in fields that are somewhat related to my area of interest, or rather areas of interest. So I'm exceedingly happy to be here. Let me begin by saying a few words about the title of this talk. It is only today that I realized that it wasn't the title that I forwarded to Toshali. It was the broad theme that Toshali was eager to have me speak on that particular topic. And she suggested that I talk about this, I discuss this, history of Bangla Dalit Sahityo or history of Bangla Dalit literature. I'm usually not very comfortable in giving thumbnail impressions about anything. I'm more focused on a particular domain, and I prefer to go deeper into that particular very selected kind of domain in a very contained fashion. That's the way I operate as a researcher. So, but I somehow missed that title, and today I suddenly realized that this is the theme that I need to talk about, that this is the theme that I need to speak on. I did have some preparations, but there was this sort of a inadvertent miscommunication that happened. But this happened, and then I was thinking of the problems that I might encounter, because I'm not exactly sure of how to go about this particular broad sort of theme for this lecture. And then I somehow realized that it also offers me some opportunities to talk about certain issues pertaining to this domain that I wouldn't have otherwise talked about. And these will be evident as I go ahead. I hope I'll be able to, make you realize why I begin with this note. So let me proceed by focusing on the key terms that are there in the title. The first term is history. So when the question is apparently a banal kind of question, when we do a history of Bangla Dalit Sahityo, what kind of history are we talking about? That is a question that I would love to ask, and then ponder over and think through that question. The second word is Dalit. How exactly do we understand the term Dalit in the context of Bengal, particularly? And Dalit and is there any incongruity between these two sets of connotations that are associated with the term Dalit? So the first term is history. Then the second term is Dalit that I want to discuss in a detailed fashion. And then the third one is literature. The focus on the term literature will help us raise questions pertaining to the term Sahityo, but also link those concerns with issues pertaining to the word Sahityo and link them with the question of Dalit or Dalit Sahityo. And I have in my mind the fact that the term Sahityo has got something to do with Shohid, to be with. So what do we necessarily mean when we utter that term, Dalit Sahityo? What does that really mean? Especially with respect to something that is almost at the heart of the canon formation of Dalit Sahityo, either in Bangla or in some other vernacular language. That is the question of lived experience. So the question is, how do we think of the issue of lived experience as something at the heart of Dalit literary discourse, Dalit cultural assertion, whatever way you want to put it? How do we link that with the term literature, Sahityo, coming from the term Shohid, something to do with the term Shohid? To be with the other, to be with. And I will later argue that this focus on the term literature and my effort to link that term literature with Dalit Sahityo will raise a more fundamental question related to the question of history, related to the domain of history, or to put it more correctly, the question of historiography, not exactly history. And the question is, this is the question with which I'll try to finish my lecture, conclude my lecture. Is Dalit a sovereign subject in history? That is the question that we need to ask. Is Dalit the sovereign subject in history? We'll talk about what it means, perhaps at the fag end of my lecture. So let me begin with the term, not the term history, although that is the first term that I said I would talk about. I would start with the term Dalit. Now, whether we like it or not, the term Dalit now simply means scheduled castes. Right? There isn't much debate about it. At least I don't see any reason to contest this statement. Given the kind of common sense that has got associated with this meaning-making process, I don't see any reason to contest that. So Dalit, underlining the fact that the term Dalit is now, in our common sense understanding, both in terms of the political world and also in discussions like this one, in literary cultural studies discussions, it primarily means the literatures, narratives produced by the scheduled caste population. Now, when I focus on the term scheduled caste, there is a specter of governmentality that haunts the term Dalit. In other words, the term Dalit looks more like a statist term, something to do with the state, the Indian nation state, as it were. And I am not exactly sure, and I have my own factual reasons to be unsure, to be somewhat confused about it. I'm not exactly sure whether that was the ideological underpinning that was intended when the term came into common parlance, primarily in the 1970s in Maharashtra, right? Because of the Dalit Panther Manifesto that came out in 1970s, early 1970s, 1972, around that time. If you look at the Dalit Panther Manifesto and the elucidation of the term Dalit there in that manifesto, you will realize that the term Dalit has a broader meaning there. It not only refers to the scheduled castes in a somewhat narrowed down sense, but it refers to a lot of disenfranchised constituencies. It refers to working class people across caste lines. It refers to farmers. It refers to women. And they might or might not be belonging to the scheduled caste category, which is ultimately, finally, a governmental category. But as we understand the term Dalit, especially in a literary studies, cultural studies context like this one, it is a fundamentally ideological term. If somebody looks at the term Dalit from this perspective, one is more tempted to understand it, comprehend it, as an ideologically loaded term. What kind of ideology? A Phule Ambedkarite kind of ideology, roughly speaking. There is a great deal of ideological difference between Jyotiba Phule and Ambedkar. We will also perhaps be able to talk about that in the context of this present discussion today. But that will only happen in a digressive manner, not in a very exhaustive fashion, if at all it happens. So, as I see the term Dalit on my diary entry today, I become confused. Does it simply imply the scheduled castes? Or does it also imply or include people who are disenfranchised in terms of other registers? And I also become confused because there is a great deal of political anxiety in this confusion. So the confusion is more intensified experience for me as a researcher in this field. A lot of Dalit activists would not even question this. They would simply keep using the term Dalit simultaneously as an ideologically loaded term, as well as a term signifying the scheduled caste population, without being bothered too much about what is written in the Dalit Panther Manifesto of 1972 in Maharashtra. Is that a bad thing? or a good thing? As a researcher, that's a bad question for me. I'm not really bothered about the fact that it is either a good thing or a bad thing. What matters to me is this sort of an indifference with which we are approaching the term Dalit, as if it does not have this complication behind it, as if the genealogy of the term Dalit is an uncomplicated trajectory, right? It can simply either mean scheduled caste populations, or it can mean an ideologically loaded term. But when we talk about an ideological load in the term Dalit, we cannot avoid the history behind the term Dalit, and we cannot ignore the history of the term Dalit as it got popularized during 1970s Dalit Panther activism in Maharashtra, right? In the way the Dalit Panther Manifesto conceptualized the term, I discern a tendency to take it away from the domain of the state to a great extent. But in our common sense understanding of the term now, in 2021, it seems, whether in Bengal or beyond, in the entire Indian nation state, within the territory of this nation state, it seems the term Dalit simply signifies scheduled caste population. And I'm not the first one to be a little confused about it. Gail Ombet was confused about it. Let me read out what Gail Ombet said in her preface, in her introductory remarks in her introduction to a book that you are all familiar with, Poison Bread, edited by Arjun Dangle. So this is what Ombet says. I'll just read out. Today, though the word Dalit remains the most recognizable word at national level, it is probably true that the majority of people classified as scheduled caste reject it for self-identification. I'll come to that part later on. It is rejected for varying reasons, in some cases as among the new Buddhists of Maharashtra, mainly, but by no means uniquely Mahars. Dalit is felt to be negative and confining. This is a separate issue from what I was underlining, but this is also relevant. I'll read out the entire paragraph. While being Buddhist gives a broader, positive, humane identity, at the same time, the differences among scheduled castes have become stark, negating any unity that might be expressed in the use of words like Dalit. In almost every region of India, there are a multitude of castes who were originally considered untouchables and are now classed as scheduled castes. Of these, there are generally two large communities, one more educated and fast to organize, the other more backward in educational and economic terms. The second group is now mobilizing, often in opposition to the first group. The conflict between Malas and Marigas of Andhra Pradesh has now become notorious, but there are also the Chura Bhangi group of the north and west who identify themselves mostly as Valmikis, the Matangas of Maharashtra and others. In most cases of the latter group is wooed by the various Hindu forces to identify themselves as Hindus, not Buddhists. In Tamil Nadu, the two largest groups have been the one-time Parayas and Pallas. The first may call themselves Dalits and frequently identify as Buddhists. The second are taking the name DVKs or Devendra Kulavaniyar. So this particular paragraph that I read out refers to a great deal of difficulty in the way we approach, or we can possibly approach, the term Dalit. I was, of course, talking about something else, But the moot point is the same, that there is a great deal of complication that we need to keep underlining when it comes to the term Dalit. As researchers in this field, I'm not an activist, quite clearly. So to put forward a certain kind of politics is neither my forte nor my intention. What I see is this great deal of difficulty in understanding the term Dalit. For me, a better method is not to reject any of these meanings and to embrace all of them and let the word surface in a very complicated fashion, so as to make the complicated genealogies of the term Dalit a more foregrounded affair, right? Instead of undermining these complicated history, we need to foreground the complicated history pertaining to the term Dalit. That is the first proposition. Now, when it comes to West Bengal, the term Dalit has to be linked to the caste question, as it were. We can't talk about the term Dalit without talking about a certain history of caste in the region. This difficulty, different kinds of difficulties that I talked about right at the beginning, the kind of difficulties that Gail Ombet underlines in this introductory comment on poison bread, become all the more complicated when we talk about the linguistic and regional specificities related to West Bengal or Bengal. There is also a complication related to the fact that this region got partitioned in 1947, and there were different kinds of equations that emerged after 1971. This gives us a very, very complicated picture of caste in West Bengal as well as in the eastern side of the region, now Bangladesh. Right? For the paucity of time, I will not be focusing on the literatures that have emerged in recent past and have got the tag of Bangla Dalit Sahityo from Bangladesh. So I will not be referring too much to Harishankar Jaladas and other writers who have emerged in Bangladesh and whose literatures are now identified by and large as Bangla Dalit Sahityo, as part of Bangla Dalit Sahityo. I'll be restricted more to West Bengal or to western part of Bengal. But some of my references will certainly go beyond that, because most of those references are related to a time before the partition, right? So colonial times and even pre-colonial times. So those references are bound to be encompassing the entire Bongo region, Bengal region. And that would include both the West Bengal, the state of West Bengal in the Indian nation state, and Bangladesh, or at least a part of Bangladesh. But we are encountering a different kind of difficulty, different level of difficulty pertaining to this already complicated history of the term Dalit, the moment we consider regional linguistic specificities of Bengal. Now, the moment we talk about the caste question and regional specificity of Bengal, the most, familiar statement that occurs to our mind is that caste does not exist in Bengal. I guess Dalit scholarship has now moved on, and the kind of achievements that it has made can comfortably allow us to disregard this question, this statement that caste does not exist in Bengal. I think we are done with that. Caste, of course, exists in Bengal. There is no doubt about it. What we probably should be more bothered about is a very complex genealogy of caste, Varna, Jati in Bangla, in Bengal, in Bongo, whatever way you want to put it. And that, in turn, further complicates the already complicated trajectory genealogy of the term Dalit, right? So this is the second layer of difficulty. What kind of difficulty do we have when we think of these regional linguistic specificities related to the term Dalit? And this is more related to the theme of our discussion this evening, Bangla Dalit Sahityo. Now, again, the Bangla term Dalito or Dalit. Dalito is the term that we are more familiar with, not exactly Dalit. Dalito would simply mean crushed, oppressed, marginalized. Ottacharito, Dalito, Nipirito, these are the synonymous terms that we have in Bangla. But that's not really the difficulty here. The difficulty is located, as I was trying to suggest, in the caste question, in the way the complex dynamics of caste in Bengal has been unfolding over centuries. Let me give you some examples. A lot of Dalit writers like Manohar Babu, Jatin Bala, Manohar Mauli Bishwas and Jatin Bala, they talk about the middle era, the so-called middle era of Bangla Sahityo. They talk about early modern periods. They talk about Mongol Kabbo. They even go back to Chorjapad. And they underline the fact that there has been instances of anti-caste voices, different kinds of anti-caste voices in these literatures. Or at least there has been some reflection of casteism in Bengal, in this region, in these literatures, in these cultural texts and artifacts. And that is true. There are different instances of caste, the reflections of caste-based experiences in the pages of these literatures. And there are social cultural historians like Nihar Ranjan Rai who have commented on this before these Dalit writers started pointing out the presence of the caste question in some form or the other in the literatures of, let us say, Bhushukpad, Kukuripad, Shabaripad, and so on. Manohar Babu's book, Dalit Sahityo Digbolay, Dalit Sahityo Ruparekha, many of these books are dedicated to these poets of pre-modern Bengal. I think Dalit Sahityo Ruparekha or Dalit Sahityo Digbolay, either of these two books, is dedicated to Shabaripad. So there is this sort of retrospective thinking in the kind of Bangla Dalit Sahityo that emerged with the leadership of Manohar Mauli Bishwas, Kalyani Thakur, Manoranjan Byapari, Jatin Bala, Nakul Mollik, Kopil Krishna Thakur, and Manju Bala, many others in the 1990s, often retrospectively project these earlier instances of caste-based experiences in Bangla Sahityo, in different examples of Bangla literature, as instances of Dalit Sahityo. I'll come to this retrospective nature of thinking in a short while. But before that, let me just draw your attention very quickly to the complications that emerge when you look at this kind of statements. Nihar Ranjan Rai's book, Bangali Itihash, famous for its perspective that resembles the historiographic method of history from below, a kind of prototype of what we now know as history from below. There is a tremendous effort on Ray's part to look at Bengal's history from the perspective of the large population that inhabits Bengal, that has inhabited Bengal, right? So his perception is more focused on the hoi polloi, the common people of this region, rather than the kings and queens and their royal affairs. So in that sense, it's a kind of very early prototype of, roughly speaking, some kind of history from below exercise. And that is why the book is quite famous, and a book that of many subaltern studies scholars, many Dalit studies scholars often look back because it somehow resembles their perspectives. So in Nihar Ranjan Roy's book, Bangali Itihash, especially in the first volume of it, there are references to caste equations in Bengal, in this region. And there are some interesting observations that Nihar Ranjan Roy makes. And these observations are related to how we have been trying to understand the word Dalit in a complicated fashion so far. Nihar Ranjan Roy says that he puts forward an Aryanization theory. I think the audience here already knows about the Aryanization theory of caste, that the Aryans invaded this part of the globe at some point of time, and eventually the defeated race, the Dravida, the dark-skinned people by and large, roughly speaking, I'm just putting it in the way it is popularly understood, in the way this tale is popularly circulated. So it's a rough representation of how this narrative is articulated by a lot of people from different ideological perspectives, from Hindutva perspective, from a Dalit perspective, from an Ambedkarite perspective, from other different scholarly perspectives, and so on. So let's not bother too much about the correct representation of this narrative. We can talk about that later. But we know that there was a point of time when, according to this theory, Aryanization theory of caste, a large part of this Indian landmass, this subcontinent, was invaded by the Aryans, and the invaded race eventually got assimilated within the Aryan social fold. And these are the people who were typically given the low ritual ranking, eventually giving birth to different varnas, the lowly varnas, the so-called untouchables, the Shudras and Shudrati Shudras, and there are different names to designate these people, but the bottom line is that this is a racial theory of caste. That is the way we need to look at it. Now, Nihar Ranjan Roy gives us this late Aryanization theory of caste in Bengal. He is suggesting that Bengal, the province of Bengal, this region, Bongo Desh, the region of Bengal, got exposed to the influence, the cultural, social influences of Aryanization, which represented something that we now call Brahminism, although we don't always know what we mean by the term Brahminism. Not very sure about that term, but that's the term that we popularly use these days in activist discourses. So I'll go by that. So a lot of people would associate Aryanization with Brahminism of some kind or the other. And Nihar Ranjan Roy is trying to argue that Bengal got exposed to this Aryanization, this Brahminization of its society and culture at a later date, and as compared to the northern part of India. And that is why the social hierarchies in Bengal, especially the Varna hierarchies in Bengal, are not as solid as they are perhaps in the northern part of India. And this has got even modern day liberal avatars, with people suggesting that the cow belt is more casteist and Bengal is not. And then there is a great deal of anger and justified anger from the Dalit activists who are trying to argue, no, it is not. The region of Bengal is no less casteist than other parts of the country, right? I'm not getting into that polemical battle. What is important for me is to understand how this Aryanization theory is put forward by Nihar Ranjan Roy in order to explain what he thinks a very loose and nebulous social hierarchical system of Jati in Bangla, in the Bengal region. And he gives us a few interesting terms and concepts. There are two things that I would like to mention in this context. One is his understanding of his categorization of the Bengali society into two dominant caste groups or Varna groups. I'm using these two terms, Varna and caste, interchangeably, although that is not entirely correct in a sociological, anthropological sense, not even in a philosophical understanding, but I hope it will be pardoned by the audience. I'm simply trying to make my point here. So he says that there are two dominant groups. One is the Brahmin, and the others, there is no reference to both these, there is no reference to Kayasthas, there is no reference to any other intermediary caste group, there is no reference to a particular reference to any lower caste group, the so-called lower caste groups. He gives us a broad term, Shudras. So for him, the Bengali society, if we have to understand it in terms of Varna hierarchies, we should understand, Ray proposes, the Bengali society simply in terms of Brahmin and Shudras. So the Kayasthas are also, Vaidhas are also, this is the implication, to be considered as Shudras. This is perhaps why a lot of Kayastha friends of mine have often told me that even Kayasthas are not really the upper castes, and have often complained that they should also probably get certain benefits of the affirmative action policy, right? I'm just wondering, but I'm not very sure about this connection. What is important in this context is how Nihar Ranjan Rai creates these two categories, Brahman and Shudra. And then he gives us two subcategories of the term of the category Shudra. One is Shat Shudra. One group is to be understood as Shat Shudra, and the other group is to be understood as Ashat Shudra. So now, related to the broader term Dalit, in the specific context of Bengal, has got these two related terms, Shat Shudra and Ashat Shudra. Within the Shat Shudra, we can roughly understand, one can include those other castes that have now become the dominant castes in the region. Brahmins, Kayasthas, and both these and other intermediary caste groups as well. At least some upwardly mobile sections of those intermediary caste groups, like Mahishos and others. In the Ashat Shudra group, we can reasonably argue that on the basis of the observations made by Nihar Ranjan Rai in his book Bangalir Itihash, that he is referring to those typically low ritual rank holding social groups. So this is becoming more complicated. If this is the history of Bengal, wherein even the modern day dominant castes like Buddhis and Kayasthas, if they are also to be to some extent understood as Shudras, how do we understand the term Dalit? That is the question that we probably need to be asking. This becomes all the more complicated when we look at the second important point that Nihar Ranjan Rai makes vis-a-vis the caste question in Bengal. He talks about the Kulin system. We know that the Kulin system had a lot to do with the idea of surplus men and surplus women in Ambedkar's anthropology seminar paper, Castes of India. Their origin, their genesis, that essay talks about surplus men and women. And the Kulin system in Bengal, which was not simply in a parochial sense only bothered about ritual ranking or purity or impurity, it was also bothered about Bangsho Marjada, Puribar Marjada, and so on and so forth. So it had other connotations. That's the point that I'm making in parenthesis. The book focuses on that question, that custom of cooling system in Bengal. And Nihar Ranjan Ray says that as opposed to a lot of people's perception that cooling system was, established in this region by the Sena dynasty, Shen Bangsha, there isn't adequate literary evidence, cultural evidence to suggest that it was actually propagated by the Shen dynasty. That is his opinion in his book Bangalir Itihash. So when we think of the term Kulin system, Kulin Protha in Bangla, and we think of those two strange categories, apparently strange categories, I'm putting the word strange within single inverted commas, Shat Shudra and Ashat Shudra, how do we think of the term Dalit? Especially as something to do with the specific caste equations in Bengal? Or do we simply be oblivious to these complex relationships of terms by suggesting that this is not important? So this is the second layer of complication. There is a third layer of complication pertaining to the term Dalit. The third layer of complication, the third level of complications emerges the moment we think of the relationship between castes and tribes. The relationship between castes and tribes. We need to remember the fact that the categorizations of caste and tribe are primarily made in the colonial times. And the word tribe in colonial ethnography is a very confusing one. In the northwestern frontiers, the term tribe, in Afghanistan region, the term tribe, the colonial implications of the term tribe, the connotations of the term tribe are very different from the way the term tribe was understood by colonial ethnographers, anthropologists, scholar scribes, as Manana Saad describes them. The way they understood the term tribe in Bengal, in other parts of the subcontinent. Sumit Guha, a very important sociologist based at the University of Texas, Austin, draws our attention to this. He also talks about how, and this is where things become quite complicated, he also talks about how the term tribe and the term caste were often used somewhat interchangeably. There are two things that Sumit Guha draws our attention to. One is how the term caste and tribe, these two words, are often bracketed. They are put together. They're used simultaneously. So in Risley's text, we have this sort of juxtaposition of caste, of the term caste, with the term tribe. The castes and tribes of India. That is the way colonial ethnography often looked at this. And they also often thought that they also often believed, like Nihar Ranjan Rai, they often believed in the Aryanization theory of caste. They, Sumit Guha points out, they often said, some of them often said, and I can quote from Guha's text, Guha refers to some of the gazetteers' reports, district gazette reports, especially in the central province, now Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And he says there was a perception, there was a colonial racialized perception of a dominant race and a weak race, a strong race and a weaker race. And the colonial ethnography often thought that the strong race, in this case the Aryan race, defeated and dominated, invaded territories belonging to the weaker race, and eventually accommodated them within their own social fold by giving them low ritual ranking, right? And thereby transforming those belonging to the weaker race into some lower castes of people. This is, as you can see, not very dissimilar, not very different from the view that we are offered in Niharanjan Ray's book. Both of them, Guha, by referring to colonial perceptions, so in colonial perceptions and in Niharanjan Ray's perception, there is a great deal of similarity when it comes to this late Aryanization theory of caste in Bengal. Guha draws our attention to the fact that this process happened at a later stage, according to many colonial ethnographers. How do we exactly know that this is how the colonial ethnographers often thought? They often thought of different groups of people as tribes, as originally belonging to the status of a tribe, and eventually getting transformed in the process of social accommodation or social assimilation, getting transformed as a lower caste. An ideal example of this process is the Bauri group. As you know, and Toshali has been working on the caste politics in Bardwan region, there is a great prominence of scheduled caste people belonging to the Bauri community in that region. So I'm assuming a lot of the people in this audience already have heard about the Bauri group of people there in the southwestern part of Bengal, in Bardwan district, some parts of Bankura and Purulia, and also some parts of my own district, West Midnapur. This is the region where the Bauri community people are concentrated. Bauris, if you look at the colonial gazette reports, and I have closely looked into these colonial documents after collecting copies of them from different state archives, I have realized that, and Bauri author Sunil Das also talks about this in some of his excellent research works, like Bauri Land, Rar Bongo, Bauri Land, and there are different books with similar titles and on similar issues, primarily related to the history of his community, Bauri community, wherein he also draws our attention to these colonial gazette reports, Bardwan district gazette reports, Midnapur district gazette reports. So if you look at the reports prepared by colonial ethnographers, colonial administrators like W.B. Oldham or L.S.S. O'Malley, Jessica Peterson, and others, you will realize that the Bauri community was actually understood by colonizers as a tribe, not a caste, to begin with. And they thought that eventually the Bauris were accommodated within the Hindu fold, the so-called Hindu fold, the Brahminical Hindu fold, if you like, and they were given a low ritual rank. And thereby they were transformed into a caste group, however, a low caste group. So the relation between caste and tribe is also a very vexed one when it comes to Bengal. I suppose it is also a vexed issue when it comes to other regions of the country, of the subcontinent. But I'm in this particular moment, at this particular moment, I'm more bothered about Bengal. So I will just restrict my comment to the specific region of Bengal and suggest that it is a vexed question. The relationship between caste and tribe is a complicated and vexed question. And if it is a vexed question, then how do we think of the term Dalit? Then there is a fourth point that I want to make pertaining to the complicated trajectory of the term Dalit in the context of Bengal. If you look at the 1990s, roughly that is the point of time when Manohar Babu and several others with him they established Bangla Dalit Sahityo Samstha in the aftermath of the Chunikotal episode. And Chunikotal, according to governmental category, was not a scheduled caste person, to the best of my knowledge. So a tribal woman's death brought about the emergence of an anti-caste Ambedkarite cultural politics in the form of Bangla Dalit Sahityo, and its organizational expression was Bangla Dalit Sahityo Samstha. There was also a Bangla Dalit Sahityo Porishad formed by people like Nokul Mollik Jatin Bala. I think Jatin Bala talks about that in his book on the origin of Dalit Sahityo in Bengal. But that, I think that was formed in 1987, around that time. But a more prominent face of Bangla Dalit Sahityo was certainly this organization called Bangla Dalit Sahityo Samstha, led by Manohar Babu, Kalyani Thakur, and several other important members, Jatin Bala included, right? So the fact that the discourse of Bangla Dalit Sahityo, the so-called Bangla Dalit Sahityo literary cultural movement and discourse got triggered, was brought about by focusing its ideological and political attention on the death of not a scheduled caste person, but a tribal lady, Chunikotal. Right? So when we understand the term Dalit simply as a scheduled caste constituency, there are different kinds of problems that emerge. Now let me quickly focus on the question of history. The question of history. And in order to do that, I'll make 2 points. One is actually a point that I want to make, an observation of some sort, and the other one is an example. And of course, I'll be making some comments on that example. And connect these 2 registers, these 2 points, with the rest of my discussion, both the previous discussion and the discussion that might follow these 2 examples or these 2 registers. One is something that I have already underscored a short while ago, but did not really elaborate upon. The retrospective nature of this canon formation. Manohar Molli Bishwas and Shamol Pramanik edited a fascinating volume, a kind of collection, an anthology of different types of Dalit Sahityo in Bangla, in a book called, in an anthology called Shotobarsher Bangla Dalit Sahityo. And if we think of the texts that are, or excerpts of different texts that are included in that volume, we will realize that the anti-caste ethos in Bengali literature is certainly not a new phenomenon. It goes back to, as Bishwas and Pramanik and Bala, they all suggest, it goes back to, in many ways, it goes back to Chorjagiti, it goes back to Bhushukpad, Kukuripad, Shaboripad, it goes back to different instances of Mongol Kabbo, it goes back to different textual evidences that they all meticulously archive in that book and in other writings of theirs. And I have no intention to contest those references because there isn't much merit in doing so. However, what I'm more interested in actually seeing how they are conceptualizing the term Dalit Sahityo. This is something that interests me as a researcher in this field. And that is why I think it is a retrospective consideration. The question is, this is a question that we need to ask as people interested in this domain. Do we consider, we don't have to go back to Chorjagiti, we don't have to go back to Mongol Kabbo, we don't have to go back to Sahajiya Vaishnav texts of 16th century to 18th century. That is a possible project, and I know about people who are working on that area. I'm not an expert on that area, and I will not even dare to comment on those examples, literary examples. There are people doing fascinating research works in those areas, and I will leave it to them to comment on those areas. But what interests me is the fact that there was certainly an absence of the so-called, as I said, somewhat nebulous Phule-Ambedkarite ideological template in those writings. No one will argue that there was this Phule-Ambedkarite anti-caste ideological imprint in those pre-modern, pre-colonial texts. There was, one can certainly argue that there was an anti-caste ethos of some sort, but it wasn't the Ambedkarite, Phule-like ideological impetus that we now associate with different types of different domains of Dalit Sahityo, Bangla, Telugu, Gujarati, Marathi. So the kind of Bangla Dalit Sahityo that starts its journey, the discourse of Bangla Dalit Sahityo that started its journey in the 1990s had a very different kind of ideological nature from those earlier examples of retrospectively considered Bangla Dalit Sahityo. I hope I'm clear. Say, for instance, Advaita Mallabarman's Kitashiti Nodin Naam had a lot of anti-caste ethos in different ways, in different episodes in the narrative. But a text published in the 1950s did not really have the kind of ideological, political charge in it that we otherwise associated with the so-called Dalit Sahityo discourse across the subcontinent, as it emerged in the 1970s in Maharashtra and thereafter spreading its influence across the subcontinent and beyond. Manohar Mauli Bishwas's Dalit Sahityer Digbalay, Dalit Sahityer Ruporekha, Jatin Bala's text on Dalit Sahityer's history, Dalit Sahityer Itihash, these texts will easily give you an impression that the kind of Dalit Sahityo, Bangla Dalit Sahityo that we have now started discussing and started looking into as researchers in this field only originated in the 1990s. So there is a dichotomy, there is a kind of paradox, there is a kind of contradiction. And contradictions or paradoxes are not really bad things. So don't, if there is anyone who feels offended with these terms, please don't be offended. These are terms that I'm simply using for the lack of better terms, and also to make a point that I see as a researcher in this domain. This is not to either offend or, offend anyone or to be liked by someone, etc. That's not the point. The point is, there is an apparent incongruity between these two claims. So on one hand, a lot of people belonging to the rest of the country, let's say a Marathi Dalit activist might ask you, or might ask me, or might ask somebody in the Dalit, Bangla Dalit scenario, that Bangla Dalit Sahityo emerged only in the 1990s. And then they might start thinking of questions as to why it happened so late. I call this particular, perception the late emergence hypothesis of Bangla Dalit Sahityo. Late emergence hypothesis. A theory of late emergence, that Bangla Dalit Sahityo emerged only in recent times, in the 1990s. And I have come across many Marathi, Telugu, Tamil, Dalit writers, activists, asking me, expressing their wonder as to why it happened so late in Bengal. Is it because the left regime ruled this state for a long time? Is it because the caste question got undermined by the class questions that the left political establishment apparently favored, liked, propagated? Or is it because of the partition? Is it because of the scattered existence of the Nomashudra population in post-partition Bengal? These are all valid reasons, and there is no doubt that these are also extremely legitimate reasons for considering this late emergence theory of Bangla Dalit Sahityo. But if we look at an instance like Shotobarsher Bangla Dalit Sahityo, we are not certainly talking about a history of Bangla Dalit Sahityo of 30 years or 40 years. We're talking about 100 years, right? We're talking about the literatures produced by Harichand Thakur, Guruchand Thakur. We are talking about Kobigan. We are talking about Mongol Kabbo. We are talking about even talking to some extent about Chorjagiti. We are talking about pre-modern texts. We are talking about colonial, the literary texts produced by different Dalit constituencies, different lower caste constituencies, lower Varna constituencies in the Bengal region in colonial times. That is not, these are not references to the 1990s. And there is a direct sort of conflict between these two. On one hand, there is this late emergence theory of Bangla Dalit Sahityo that it emerged only in 1990s, and it has a point. The kind of Dalit politics, the kind of Ambedkarite, fully Ambedkarite ideological influence that we associate with Dalit Sahityo in general and Bangla Dalit Sahityo of the 1990s, from the 1990s, was not really present in Adwaita Merleau-Ponty. Binoy Majumdar was certainly not the typical Dalit poet in that sense. But also lower caste poets, writers, Adwaita Merleau-Ponty, at least Adwaita Merleau-Ponty's Sita Shittinudinam has too many references to different caste equations in the region. So there is some level of difficulty when it comes to the history of Bangla Dalit Sahityo, right? But there is another instance. I said there are two registers with which I will elaborate this part of my lecture. So what is the second point? The second point, again, is something that I have already highlighted, but did not really link with this present concern. This present concern that I'm trying to raise now, the question of history. I have referred to the Aryanization theory of caste, even late Aryanization theory of caste in Bengal. In Niharanjan Ray's text, Bangalir Itihas, I have talked about the similar theory, as propagated by different colonizers in different colonial documents, especially the district gazette reports. So there is a continuity there. And Niharanjan Ray's text is also, especially his comments on the Borno caste system in Bengal, were also based on texts like Brahma Vaivarta Puran, etc. Thanks to a book like Nicholas Darks's Castes of Mind, we know that such colonial textualism often resulted in this Aryanization theory of caste. But that's not the point where the story ends. If you look at the example of Maharashtra's caste politics, somewhat before Ambedkar arrived on the platform, on the anti-caste theatre, if we look at Phule's politics, anti-caste politics, if we look at Jyotiba Phule's 1873 text, Gulamgiri, slavery, we get to know that Jyotiba Phule also believed in this Aryanization theory of caste. He also thought that these Aryans, read upper castes, Savarnas, twice-born people, they are all outsiders. They are like colonizers. So when on one hand these people criticize British colonialism, but the fact is, Phule and people like Phule would argue, these are also colonizers. Colonizing a large group of people with relatively darker skin tone and people in colonial terminology belonging to a weaker race. These are the people who have been the Onarjo people, as it were. These are the people who are the original inhabitants of this land. So there is a politics of autochthony there. There are autochthonous claims, the claims of who is the original inhabitant of a particular landmass. this original inhabitant status is an autochthonous claim. And that politics of autochthony is quite present in Phule's writings, like his 1873 text, Gulamgiri. But the question that we need to probably be asking is, in this context, is does that have a Bengal avatar? Does that theory, does that brand of anti-caste politics, that Phule type of anti-caste politics, also have its presence in modern-day Bengal, in the domain of Bangla Dalit Sahityo or Bangla Dalit literary movement or cultural narratives? The answer is yes. In 2015, because of my PhD, I had to do some field work. This is something that I love to describe as field work, but I'm not really a trained sociologist or an anthropologist or a political scientist, so I can't legitimately claim to have done some field work, quote unquote. But I did some kind of, roughly speaking, field work in Purulia district, in Malda district. And I was there in those two districts primarily to collect narratives on Oshur Utsav, on Hudur Durga Oshur Sharon program. And I collected quite a few, not really quite a few, but a large number of narratives, cultural narratives, literary texts, not really literary texts, but pamphlets, some propagandist literatures that are related to this particular program that is observed every year. When we celebrate Durga Pujo, and by that term I refer to Bengali populations across caste lines, including the OBCs and the SCs, and also increasingly STs. When we celebrate Durgotsav, there is this sort of program of Oshur Sharon in these districts and also in some other parts of Bengal. I know about a similar program that is observed every year in places near Kolkata, Goria, etc., in South Kolkata. So it's not restricted to Murshidabad, Malda, and Purulia. It is also observed in different other parts of the state. But I'm not really interested whether it is observed across the state, across the country. What interests me is that the fundamental core of this narrative that is operating behind this particular Utshav, Oshur Sharon Utshav, Hudur Durga Oshur Sharon Utshav, the fundamental narrative is based on the Aryanization theory of caste. It also suggests that Aryan invaders came, invaded these people, their civilizations were plundered, disrupted, etc., destroyed. Their legacies were destroyed. And they were colonized. And Durga cunningly killed Ashura, Mahishasur, who is a representative of the Onarju population of this country, of this region. And to celebrate Durgotsav is therefore to perform a Brahminical socio-cultural practice. Instead, we should mourn the death of Ashur, Mahishasur. So that is what they do during Hudur Durga Utshav, Hudur Durga Oshur Sharon Utshav. Now the question is, there are two questions that emerge from this reference. How do we think of the history of caste in Bengal if we continue to participate in this kind of cultural articulations under the broader rubric of Bangla Dalit Sahityo, or Bangla Dalit Sanskriti Sahityo, whatever? the kind of Mullibashi articulations, autochthonous claims that are associated with the Hudud Durga Oshu Utsav are quite a significant part of the Bangla Dalit literary discourse. And yet, historically, or in terms of its representation of history of caste in this region and elsewhere in the subcontinent, it offers us a complicated trajectory. Now we have Jyotiba Phule's anti-caste politics, believing in the Aryanization theory of caste. We have the colonizers believing in the Aryanization theory of caste and thereby explaining the transformation of certain kinds of tribes into different lower caste groups. We have Nihar Ranjan Rai commenting on Bengal's caste question by invoking this Aryanization theory of caste. And then in the after 1990s, after the rise of Bangla Dalit Sahityo discourse, we have Oshud Sharan Utsav, which is based on the Aryanization theory of caste as elucidated, as also enunciated by Phule in his 1873 Gulamgiri. So when we look at this sort of a complicated trajectory of history of caste and caste-related theories, explanatory theories of caste in Bengal, late Aryanization is a theory that certainly invokes Aryanization theory of caste. So that is the reason why, that is the excuse why I'm talking about it. When we talk about this sort of a complicated history of the caste question in Bengal, how do we make sense of the apparent claim that Bangla Dalit Sahityo is somewhat in the 1990s, after 1990s, is born out of an Ambedkarite legacy? Because clearly Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was not propagating this theory. He was somewhat apprehensive of this Aryanization theory of caste. He was apprehensive about this Aryanization theory of caste in Annihilation of Caste, published in 1936. He was also apprehensive about this Aryanization theory of caste in many of his other writings, especially in his writings on the idea of broken men, people who were described by Ambedkar as broken men in Indian history. Buddhists, befitting people, getting transformed into untouchables, broken men. These broken men were not simply the Onarjo population of the subcontinent. In fact, Ambedkar, anticipating a lot of recent academic research on the question of Aryanization theory of caste or Aryan invasion theory, he anticipated those research works of our times by suggesting that the word Aryan is primarily a linguistic word. It's not a racial term if we look at the Vedic literature. So unlike a lot of Dalit activists of our time, Ambedkar seems to be a more patient, a more nuanced reader of those pre-modern, ancient, so-called Brahminical texts. And he comes up with this inference that the Aryanization theory of caste does not help us read the complicated theory of caste in the subcontinent. Instead, he propagated a different view of caste in the country. He is talking about the ideological conflict between Brahminism and Buddhism. He is talking about the theory of broken men. Now, if that is the ideological imprint that Ambedkar leaves behind, how do we conveniently link that legacy, that Ambedkarite legacy, with the discourse of Bangla Dalit Sahityo, especially when it includes cultural articulations like that of Hudud Durga Oshu Utsav? Right? Now, I think we are running out of time, so without getting into other details related to what we have already talked about, I will move on to the last part of the talk and focus on the term literature. If we think of the term Dalit Sahityo, Dalit literature, one of the fundamental characteristics of it is the question of lived experience. And thanks to Gopal Guru and his conversations with Sundar Sarukkai and the publication of the book, The Cracked Mirror, published by Oxford University Press, thanks to the debate that unfolded, or rather debates that unfolded in the pages of the Economic and Political Weekly, wherein Partho Chatterjee participated, Gopal Guru participated, Sarukkai participated, A. Raghurama Raju participated, Balmurli Natarajan participated. Thanks to that debate, those debates, we know what lived experience is. But for the sake of this audience, I will just describe it in a nutshell. The question of lived experience is to be clearly understood with an example that Sarukkai often gives in those debates that happened in EPW, and also gives in the debate in the book, The Cracked Mirror. He gives us this hypothetical example. He gives us this hypothetical scenario. He asks us to imagine a group of trainee astronauts in a gravitation-free chamber on this planet. They are still on this planet, but they are inserted in this gravitation-free chamber with a steady oxygen supply. And he asks us to imagine a point of time wherein this oxygen supply is interrupted. And he says, if that happens to these trainee astronauts, they have the option, because they are ultimately on this planet, this gravitation-free chamber within which they are getting trained as astronauts, they can easily come out of that chamber and they can breathe and they can save their lives. But imagine what would have happened if this had happened in the space out there. They do not have any choice if it happens in the space. Sarukkai wants us to think of this second scenario as the scenario of lived experience. If you are born as a Dalit, the kind of experiences that you are supposed to undergo in a caste society like ours will be so unique that cannot be simulated, that cannot be replicated, and thereby experienced by other people. So by default, it excludes the Savarnas, the twice born, the Dijo people. They do not have the unique access to the lived experiences of being a Dalit. Manik Bandyopadhyay can stay with Dalits. Tarashankar can stay with Dalits in order to get better perspectives on how these people live their lives and represent those episodes and different experiences in their fictional writings. Hashulibake Rupakatha, Paddanudir Maji, and some such work. But that does not mean they will have access to the lived experience. Now, this is clearly quite acceptable a proposition for me. However, what becomes problematic is when we insert the question of lived experience in the domain of literature. If literature, or the Bangla, Sanskrit, Hindi term Sahityo, is related to Shohid, then it is all about the sense of ennui that we might cultivate in the process of reading a piece of literature. The question of empathy, for instance. And if empathy and ennui are tropes through which we can ethically participate in the described experiences of Dalits, if that is the definition of Sahityo that we hold on to, then how do we think of the unique status of lived experience? I would suggest very humbly that we accept the unique status of lived experience as a constitutive element, as a defining characteristic of the Dalit experience, the Dalit question, the caste question in this country, and therefore the Dalit Sahityo discourse. And that certainly includes Bangla Dalit Sahityo discourse. But at the same time, we leave out some possibilities of reading wherein there is a chance to participate for the non-Dalits to experience in the mode of empathy, to share those experiences as they read these works of literature. I am not exactly sure whether it is a very tenable argument, but that is the way I would prefer to see it. Now, I will be leading slowly towards the final question, with which I will conclude, and then I'll be inviting questions if you have any other comments, and even reservations about whatever I have said so far. And this final question is related to the issue of lived experience and Sahitya. The question that I want to ask is Dalit the sovereign subject in history? Now, what does that really mean, a sovereign subject in history? When we talk about issues pertaining to marginality, and I am quite aware of the fact that this platform is about different engagements with marginality. This series of lectures is focused on that. For every time about marginality, whether it is the question of queer people, whether it is the question of women or Dalits or Adivasis, Muslims, different other minoritized constituencies in this country and beyond, we talk about the question of agency. I was having a very quick conversation with a university professor friend of mine, very close friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, who was discussing Can the Subaltern Speak with me the other day. And we were talking about how a lot of people are actually not so attentive towards this issue of agency. Agency of Dalits, agency of queer people, transgender people, women, other minoritized constituencies like them, the list can go on. We can think of the African American people in the American context, and the Aboriginal people in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries in Canada. But ultimately, there's an interruption. But ultimately, the question is, and in some way or the other, derive the statements like this, that of lived experience, the question of lived experience. Talk about a greater quantity, some measuring tool. Hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible? শোনা যাচ্ছে এবার?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
That the discourse of Dalit Sahityo in general, and Bangla Dalit Sahityo subtly as a particular instance, this is tied to the issue of lived experience. And lived experience apparently is giving these narratives, providing these narratives with a greater quantum of agency. And that is the way the difference of Dalit Sahityo is articulated from the rest of literary works that are concerned with issues of marginality. Mani, Shankar, and many other instances, right? Sharatchandra, Rabindranath as well. That is the way this difference is articulated. That is at the heart of the politics of canon formation of Bangla Dalit Sahityo. If that is so, we are in a scenario wherein there is a claim, and this is often a positivist claim, there is a tendency to make a positivist claim of a knowable subject in history, somebody who knows and therefore articulates. This is all the more prominent in the very dominant, in the very fact that the genre of autobiography is dominant in Bangla Dalit Sahityo. And autobiography typically carries that sense of not only a greater agency, but also a greater sense of liberal individualism and the positivist notion of a sovereign subject, an entity that knows and therefore articulates. But the problem is there is no such sovereign subject in history. What does this mean? Does it mean that the Dalits cannot articulate their voices? They do not have a unique statement to make emerging out of their lived experiences? No, they certainly have that scope and they are doing it. And that's a wonderful thing to have happened. But what we need to be aware when it comes to history, the term history of Bangla Dalit Sahityo or history of caste, what we need to be aware is that a greater emphasis on the question of agency might lead us to understand the term Dalit as carrying a greater quantum of a sovereign subject, wherein there is a great deal of a positivist claim that he or she knows. This helps in selling a book, that this is the narrative of a Dalit who knows that he or she is a Dalit. That kind of sovereign knowing subject in history is also somebody who is subjected to history. Therefore, the term Dalit has to be understood, perhaps, in these two ways simultaneously. There is certainly in the term Dalit, the term Dalit is encapsulating a greater quantum of agency. But any close reading of Manohar Babu's wonderful autobiography or Kalyani Thakur Charal's wonderful autobiography, brilliant autobiography, Manoranjan Bapari's autobiography, Itibitte Chandal Jibon, Manohar Babu's autobiographical narrative, Amar Bhubane Ami Beche Thaki. When you read these texts closely, don't just stop at the cover page. That emphasizes on the sovereign subject of a Dalit. That autobiography of a Dalit, life of a Dalit in Bengal. These are the subtitles, right? That's for the publishers to be worried about. But as researchers, as readers, as people interested in this literary discourse, I think we should be careful about what we come across the moment we try to attempt a close reading of these texts. When we read these texts closely, we do not necessarily come across this all-knowing, positivist, sovereign subject who is constantly obsessed with his or her agency. What we instead come across is the narrative of communities. When you read Amar Bhubane Ami Beche Thaki by Manohar Mauli Bishwas, you do not simply read his own narrative in terms of a rags to riches narrative, the typical liberal tale. When you read Bapari's autobiography or Jatin Bala's autobiographical narrative, Shikor Chhena Jibon, you do not, or Mukul Mullik's Khomani, you do not necessarily come across the celebration of a sovereign subject, the question of the I in the autobiography. That is not what we necessarily come across when we read the text. The text the content of the text, the very content of it. What we come across is the bifurcation of that sovereign subject. There is certainly the question of lived experience, adding some nuances that can only be added when somebody has access to lived experiences. Thereby, in our activists' terminology, there is a greater quantum of agency in them, these articulations. But at the same time, the kind of explorations in marginality that these texts offer do not conveniently give us a scenario wherein a sovereign subjecthood is celebrated. I think this is the note that we need to take into consideration in order to move beyond the conflict, the polemical debate that has been happening between people who believe in Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak and people like us who have been more aligned with the ideological articulations, cultural narratives of Bangla Dalit Sahityo. Right? So I think I should stop here. I have only been able to talk about certain complications, problems, limitations, confusions, but I have only done that with this expectation that they will lead us into some other more insightful domain or phase when it comes to discussing Bangla Dalit Sahityo. That was my intention. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Now we would invite questions, observation, or comments. If anyone has any question to make or any observation to make, you can raise your hand or you can just unmute the mic. Or if you find difficulty in unmute the mic and talking out, then you can put your question in the chat box. Thank you. So there is a question from Nazrul Islam, Joginder Shikando Ijaz ডক্টর আইয়ুব রাইন প্রমুখদের হাত ধরে দলিত মুসলিম সম্পর্কিত আলোচনা বাংলার বাইরে শুরু হয়েছে, এমনকি ডক্টর বি আর আম্বেদকরও বাংলার মুসলমান সমাজে জাতপাতের কথা তুলেছেন পার্টিশন অফ ইন্ডিয়া গ্রন্থে। অথচ আশ্চর্যজনকভাবে বাংলা দলিত সাহিত্যিকেরা দলিত মুসলমান বিষয়টি নিয়ে সোচ্চার নন। এই সম্পর্কে আপনার মতামত জানাবেন স্যার।
বাহ, খুব জরুরি প্রশ্ন। আর
আচ্ছা,
আরো একটা প্রশ্ন, তারপর দুটো প্রশ্ন উত্তর দেবো।
তারিক আনোয়ার হ্যাজ রেজড আ হ্যান্ড। আপনি বলতে পারেন, আপনি আনমিউট করে বলুন। তারিক আনোয়ার স্যার, ইউ ক্যান আনমিউট ইয়োরসেলফ।
হ্যাঁ, তারিক বলুন।
Good evening, sir. Can you hear me?
I can hear
sir,
you.
I have a,
bolun.
Sir, so much as I know, the main objective of Dalit literature is to fight against caste discrimination and to build an egalitarian society. Kansa Ilaya, in his book Why I Am Not Hindu, says that Dalits consider themselves more Hindus than the Hindu themselves. So my question is it possible to remove caste discrimination being Hindu or believing in Hindu scriptures?
Is it possible? What?
Is it possible to remove caste discrimination being a Hindu or believing in Hindu religion or scriptures?
Okay, I got it. Okay, so both the questions have got something similar in them. They are both questions related to caste and religion. That's the template of the two questions. So I'll just take these two questions very quickly and try to address them as quickly as possible. I can't give you a very detailed answer. To the first question that was asked, I think I am quite aware of the fact that the Muslim community in this subcontinent can at times be as casteist as the Hindus. In fact, if not more. I have had tremendously casteist experiences, caste-based experiences in northern part of India coming from the Muslims. The Sayyid Muslims in Lucknow, in different parts of the Uttar Pradesh state, have often made extremely casteist statements to me. The Muslim Pakistan or partition of India, but he also mentions that in texts that he had written 20 years before partition of Pakistan or partition of India, which was published in the 1940s, in 1946 around that time. In Annihilation of Caste, for instance, he talks about the presence of casteist behavior among Muslims. And in a book that I mentioned in my talk today, Shumit Guha's Beyond Caste, there are references to how a sense of caste, it can't be a very strict definition of caste, but some sense of caste, something analogous to the caste structure is also present, has been present in the Muslim society as well in the subcontinent. And this is reflected in words like Qaum, Kabila, the Persian term Zat. So that's not a new thing. In fact, if you look at some of the narratives of the Sufi saints, despite the fact that we all think of the Sufi saints as, wonderfully liberal people, progressive people, all kinds of things, good things. Nizamuddin Auliya used to narrate a story that had, and Guha talks about this story, a kind of, it might be an apocryphal narrative, but we do associate a particular narrative wherein there was a child born out of a relationship, illicit relationship between a member in an aristocratic Muslim family and their slave. And the child born out of it, Nizamuddin Auliya is describing, the child born out of it started very soon in his childhood, early adolescence, started showing signs of signs of corruption, signs of unacceptable social behavior. And Nizamuddin Auliya is trying to suggest that if you give birth to a child like that out of this kind of illicit relationship, sexual relationship, then this is the result that you get. In other words, he's talking about purity of blood. And purity of blood, by the way, is a notion that came all the way from the Iberian Peninsula to the Indian landmass and got somehow married to the notion of already existing notion of caste in the Indian subcontinent, especially in the southern part of the country. I'm talking about Roberto de Nobili traveling all the way from Europe to the Malabar region and trying to convert the local Brahmins, and the Brahmins resisting some of those proselytizing efforts by suggesting that we do not want to lose our status as Brahmins. So we want to be Christians, we are willing to be Christians, but we need to be Brahmin Christians. So that kind of thing has its own genealogy. And certainly the Muslim community has been practicing something analogous to caste, if not caste as such, if that is what we associate with the Hindu social system of caste. And this is also reflected in the existence of Pasmanda Muslims, the Bihari Pasmanda Muslims in Bangladesh at present. Many of these Bihari Muslims were used by the Rajakar team during 1970s, 1970-71, Mukti Juddher Shomoy. And now these people, the Bihari Muslims, are stigmatized. They are mainly the manual scavengers on in the city of Dhaka and Chittagong and so on. So there is a solid presence of caste in the Muslim society as well, it seems. But there is also a very interesting history of Dalit Muslim unity in this part of the subcontinent. Dr. Nurul Islam, the retired IPS officer, Swapon Biswas, retired Indian Administrative Service officer, and a lot of other people are trying to create what they describe as Dalit Muslim unity. And I have written about it. My dissertation will someday become a book, and if that book gets published, you'll be able to read it. I have actually talked about that Dalit Muslim unity in my doctoral dissertation. So I'm aware also of another kind of trajectory wherein the Dalits and Muslims are shaking hands with each other in order to fight the Brahminical dominance, hegemony, whatever you want to call it, in this part of the subcontinent. So there is this sort of an effort, a political, ideological effort on the part of both Dalits and Muslims to forge alliances against the dominance of the so-called upper caste people, the so-called Aryans, Savarna people. So there is some level of resistance to that sort of history. And the relationship between Dalits and Muslims is also very interesting. The moment we talk about the caste question in Bengal, the moment we talk about the utter the term Dalit in Bengal, we talk about the Namoshudras. But the caste question in Bengal cannot be exhausted simply by focusing on the Namoshudras. We have the Bauris, we have the Pondokhotrios, we have Rajbongshis, we have the Bagdis and Domes and so many other constituencies that create a substantial part of the Dalit population in the state. We have the second or third largest Dalit population in the entire country in Bengal. So, these other constituencies are also important. So when you look at those constituencies, they are certainly not haunted by the deeply disturbing communal history of partition that mark and continue to mark the narratives of Nomoshudra people or the politics of Nomoshudra people in our times. Bauris were not directly affected by partition. So how do we think of a relationship, a possibility of a unity between Bauris and Muslims, or the lack of it? How do you think of the relationship between Domes and Muslims, Bagdis and Muslims, right? So these are complicated questions that other researchers will be needing to sort of engage with in order to adequately respond to your question. But as of now, I can tell you that there are these two sides of, two ways of looking at the issue that you wanted me to talk about. I hope that sort of somehow responds to your question. And I think the second question, can we fight caste if we continue to be Hindu or something like that? That was the second question, I think. Well, I don't know. Historically, a lot of Dalits converted to Buddhism. A lot of Dalits have been converted to Islam and Christianity. Has caste lived their lives? No. So getting converted to other religions, I don't know. Continuing or discontinuing as Hindu, does that have some level of impact on the experiences of caste? One can't be sure. Right? Is there any other question? I think Shubhayu raised his hand. I wanted to ask some question.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you after a long time, actually. My observation is like, based on basically two premises, sir. I will let me just elaborate a little. The first is the idea of the very idea of the institutionalization of Dalit Sahityo, in the sense if Sahityo is somewhat derivative of Shohit, which is to be with, then there is also the question of somebody who immediately knows the experience of the other. For example, Dalit Sahityo, for example, in the sense we understand it today, is more or less based on that same bias for the written word or the written script, archiving, chronicling, documenting, which in fact is very colonial in the sense, because we have the ideas of J.S. Mill and others who have talked about the fact that ancient India lagged some sort of a written documentation, and the kind of rational arguments given in favor of utilitarianism was based on a kind of a written chronicle. So that is number one. how do you associate this with the Dalit Sahityo? It's the Dalit Sahityo representation somewhat imitating the very discourse that marked the colonial fabric. And the second question, which is tied to the first question,
Your voice
is
your
the
voice is
fact that
breaking,
probably
Shubhayu.
this
I
Aryanization
can
theory, which
only
again
hear half of
talk.
your question, and then
Okay. Am I audible? Am I audible now?
Now you are audible.
Uh, uh, hmm. so the first question is related, so therefore, to the idea of the Dalit Sahitya itself being a derivative discourse, in the sense that it is
Again,
again.
I lost you, I think. Yes,
Uh,
Ba.
Sir, am I audible now?
Right. Yeah. Go on.
Uh, I'm typing my. Yeah. Okay. So, sir, the thing is, the first question is related to the derivative discourse of the Dalit Sahitya representation itself, in the sense it talks about again that same idea of chronicling and representing the written word, as opposed to, let us say, lived experience in the form of that which cannot be written, cannot be formalized, cannot be expressed without certain formats, standard literary formats. That is the number one question. And the number two question was related to the Aryanization theory again, where probably this idea, the example that you gave of Chuni Kotal's death becoming some sort of a stimulus for the Dalit Sahitya, the Dalit Sahitya movement itself, because the representation of the caste question, in lieu of the Aryanization theory, that in fact stood to be a very convenient representation for certain caste groups within Bengal itself, and I have specifically the Rajbangshi movement in mind. So again, that in fact was part of a derivation. So how do you link, or how do you see derivation as very much fundamental to the aspect of the Dalit representative kind of discourse? Thank you, sir.
Sir, you have to unmute.
Sorry, Shubhayu, I think I missed almost 70% of what you said in your question. I had to log out and then log in again. So,
Okay,
তুমি কি
okay,
একটু
I'll
রিপিট
type.
করতে
Can I type the?
হ্যাঁ ছোট্ট করে করে দাও হ্যাঁ
Okay,
হ্যাঁ
sir.
মিনওয়াইল আই থিংক
প্রথম
হ্যাঁ বলো
হ্যাঁ স্যার, প্রথম কোয়েশ্চেনটা ওয়াজ রিলেটেড টু দ্য আইডিয়া অফ ডেরিভেটিভ ডিসকোর্স, মানে কিভাবে the Dalit Sahitya representation itself is following the tropes of derivation, because we abar it is taking recourse to chronicling, archiving, documentation as somewhat legitimate tropes of literary representation, as opposed to
got it
non-legitimate forms of representation.
got it No, my answer is yes, you are right to some extent, in the sense that the apparent claims of the canon formation vis-a-vis Dalit Sahitya, they would, those claims would actually substantiate what you, or these claims will prove you right. Those claims are derivative. The claims of canon formation. But I am trying to underscore the fact that there is a disjunct, there is a kind of disconnect between the claims of canon formation that are articulated either on the cover page, the focus on the subtitle that includes the term Dalit inevitably, the way Dalit politics cultural assertions are articulated in the public domain. So in this sort of an outward manifestation of this cultural assertion, we see that kind of a derivative discourse, and you are right there. But when it comes to actually reading, the experience of reading those texts, despite the fact they are autobiographical texts, and they have a large possibility of getting reduced to the kind of derivative discourse or the status of simply archiving the fixation of the written word that you spoke about, simply archiving the experiences of marginality. In fact, if you look at the fact that most of the research works on this domain are actually done in the sociology department, in the political science department, as if these are simply archives of social experiences. The singularity of the literary text is reduced to the status of a mere archival document, right? I think that is something that you were trying to refer to in some sense or the other. So that is certainly true when it comes to the way these articulations are circulated, and those political claims of canon formation are articulated. But the moment you read and get yourself immersed in the singularity of a particular narrative, it is no longer an articulation of simple sovereign positivist subject of history or a simple derivative discourse that is fixated upon that idea of archiving the experiences of social exclusion. বুঝতে পারছি আমি কি মোটামুটি রেসপন্ড করলাম কি ওটা তোমার প্রশ্নে? You had a long question, but
yes.
হ্যাঁ, তুমি কি এগ্রি করো? মানে what do you think of this argument that I am putting forward?
Somewhat yes, মানে if we go contextually বা content wise গেলে
there is a dichotomy between the kind of apparent claims of canon formation that are made by the Dalit Sahityakar, by the publisher and other people around it. আর যখন পড়ছি তখন I am encountering something very different. হ্যাঁ, সেখানে কিন্তু শুধু ওই ফিক্সেশনটা নেই, ওই যে ফিক্সেশন, তুমি মনোহর বাবুর টেক্সটটা পড়ে দেখো, মনোহর বাবুর টেক্সটটা পড়লে কিন্তু শুধু মনে হবে না তুমি দলিত সাহিত্যের একটা টেক্সট পড়ছো, মানে ওইভাবে যে ক্লেমটা তৈরি হয় শুধু সেটাই নয়, কিন্তু সেম উইথ আদার টেক্সট। তুমি কপিল কৃষ্ণ ঠাকুরের যখন উজানতলির উপকথা পড়ছো তখন তোমার কিন্তু সত্যি সত্যি মনে হচ্ছে না যে শুধুমাত্র একটা সবসময় আম্বেদকরাইট দলিত অ্যান্টি কাস্ট আইডিওলজিকে মাথায় রেখে রেখে লেখা হচ্ছে, and the writing subject knows what he or she is talking about. হ্যাঁ, এই যে একটা অথরিয়াল আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং, সেটা কিন্তু অনেকটা সাবসাইডেড, যেটা হয় আর কি, যেটা যে কোনো লিটারারি টেক্সটের ক্ষেত্রেই সিঙ্গুলারিটি অফ দ্য টেক্সট, মানে সেইটা কিন্তু তুমি ওই ডেরেক অ্যাট্রিজের কথা বলতে চাইছি আর কি আমি, যে সেইটা কিন্তু তখন তুমি এক্সপেরিয়েন্স করছো, সেটা একটা ডিফারেন্ট কাইন্ড অফ এক্সপেরিয়েন্স ফ্রম দ্য আদারওয়াইজ অ্যাপারেন্ট, of course when it comes to those apparent articulations you are very right. There is a sense of derivation and there is a sense of, I would even say, counterproductive sort of derivative discourse. কিন্তু এটা অনেকটা নেগেটেড হয় in the experience, in the very actual singular sort of experience of getting immersed in the text. সেইটাকে আমার মনে হয় আমাদের
অ্যাকচুয়ালি স্যার আমি কেন বলতে চাইলাম এটা, মানে বিকজ মানে যদি ট্রান্সডিসিপ্লিনারি দেখি, যে ট্রান্সডিসিপ্লিনারিটি দিয়ে দেখি, যে যদি কেউ বলে যে মানে একদম গভর্নমেন্টালিটি ট্রোপস ইউজ করে, যে you see the scheduled caste population constitutes so much percentage, scheduled tribe population constitutes so much percentage, এবারে এইটাকে ইউজ করে কেউ যদি the people within the Dalit Sahityo Academy ওরা সেইটাকে যদি কেউ মেজার করে, সেবারে এই গভর্নমেন্টালিটি ট্রোপটা ইউজ করেই বলা যেতে পারে যে you see this covers a significant portion of the scheduled caste population as opposed to the scheduled tribe population. So in a sense the minority is always remaining there, মানে এই ভাবে, মানে আমি একদম অর্গানাইজেশনাল স্ট্রাকচার ওয়াইজ কেউ যদি এই ক্লেমটা করে,
হ্যাঁ তুমি
এবারে সেখান থেকে
when it comes to institutionalization of the thing, তখন এটা এটা তখন অনেকটাই হয়, আমার নিজের কথা হচ্ছে এটা হয়, মানে ওটা নিয়ে লুকোছাপা করে লাভ নেই, এটা হয়। কিন্তু সেইটা কতটা, মানে সেটার একটা, মানে হোয়াট ইজ দ্য ওয়ে আউট দেন? তাহলে কি শুধু রাষ্ট্রকেন্দ্রিক কিছুই করবে না, আবার করলেও ফাঁদে পড়ছে, মানে দের ইজ এ প্যারাডক্স দেয়ার। হ্যাঁ মানে জ্ঞানেন্দ্র পান্ডে তো talked about that paradox, this sort of liminality of that experience. হ্যাঁ, তো সেইটা is constituted of the subalternity or marginality or whatever way you want to put it. হ্যাঁ, তো সেইটা তুমি যেটা বলছো ইনস্টিটিউশনালাইজড এতে, কিন্তু যখন সাহিত্যের ডোমেনে আমি ঢুকছি, হ্যাঁ আমার কাছে যখন সাহিত্যের টেক্সটটা ওই রকম একটা সিঙ্গুলার এক্সপিরিয়েন্স হয়ে উঠে আসছে, তখন কিন্তু জিনিসগুলো অন্যরকম, তখন ওটা জীবন, তখন আর ওটা ওরকম ওই রাষ্ট্রকেন্দ্রিক হিসেব নিকেশের বাইরে, বুঝেছো? তো আর কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে?
Hello, sir. May I audible?
Yes.
You are audible.
Okay, thank you, sir, for this wonderful session. And sir, I'm thinking that mainly Dalit literature deals with the lived experiences or the autobiographical narratives. So when we know, like when it comes to the mainly autobiographical narratives of the men, so it's quite different from the women. So what do you think the lived experience of the women we should think in a quite different way, or in a same way we have to deal with this? And what about the like Dalit feministic literature? So if you please give some examples on that and elaborate this point.
দেখো examples, I can give you some examples of how Dalit women's voices are often articulated in extremely interesting ways. You can read Bama's Sangati, for instance, or Kolani Thakur's texts, wherein you do not simply have the experiences of Dalitness in terms of caste, but also in terms of gender. So just take a quick look at these texts and you'll get a glimpse of what we are trying to refer to here. But how do we think through that? Do we need a different kind of template within the Dalit template? I'm not very sure of that, because I see the question of caste directly related to the question of gender. I think the institution of caste, both in terms of sexual relationships and in terms of other social relationships, is very much related to the way gender ideas operate in our patriarchal social structure. So they are related to each other, and when you are fighting a battle against caste and using the Dalit anti-caste discourse as some kind of an avenue through which you are fighting that battle, you are also willingly or unwillingly or inadvertently, you are also fighting a battle against the gender equations that are prevalent in our patriarchal society. So they go hand in hand with each other. I don't think you have to construct a different sort of course it has its own unique status, because once again the so-called unique experiences of being a Dalit woman will most likely complicate the experiences of Dalit men in our society and the reflections thereof in the pages of Dalit Sahityo. So that's there, but do we have a different conceptual terrain altogether? I'm not exactly sure. And Dalit feminism has got everything to do with both caste and gender, and it's not in any way, discursively speaking, dissociated from the rest of the Dalit discourse. It is linked to that. It's a central part of the Dalit anti-caste discourse. So that would be my quick response to your question. And if you want examples, you can just open any text by Sivakami or Baby Kamle or Kolani Thakur Charal or Manju Bala and so many texts.
Okay, sir, thank you.
Also, there is this book by Anindita Pan named Mapping Dalit Feminism.
Right, there are different books on Dalit feminism. If you are thinking of a theoretical, conceptual sort of apparatus to think through these issues, Pan's text is quite good. There is also a text edited by I think Akash Singh Rathore on Dalit feminism, published by Routledge. And there is also a collection of poems and other writings. I haven't been able to go through it, translated anthology of some texts produced by Bengal's women Dalit authors, Kolanidi and Professor Dasgupta at Jadavpur Comparative Literature Department. They have, I think, edited that volume published by Sri Shammo Sage. That's called Dalit Lekhika. তোমরা সেটাও দেখতে পারো, but that's a collection of creative writings, not critical essays.
Sir, if you would you like to take any other question, or should we conclude it here?
Now, I think one of my former students, Rishabh, has asked a question. I'd just like to quickly address that and then call it a day and say bye-bye to all of you. So could you read out that question?
Rishabh Paul has asked, sir, I can think of some Dalit literature that are critical in relation to the self as well as community. Manoranjan Bapari's ordeal when he tries to self-publish his first book and his comments on the same in Chandal Jibon and Dalit feminist literature. Is the self-critical turn more prominent around the turn of the century, or is it visible in older texts?
That self-criticality, Rishabh, is I think done in a more self-conscious fashion increasingly at the turn of the century. But if you look at the earlier examples, that self-criticality might be there, not in a very self-conscious fashion, because most of those earlier examples were not so overtly autobiographical in many ways. So most of those texts are not always offering us that sort of an self-critical turn in a very apparent way, but there is certainly that possibility. কিন্তু যেটা পরের দিকে টেক্সটগুলোতে I think it's more apparent, simply because of the fact that the writers are more increasingly sensitive to those issues. সেটা একটা হতে পারে. I'm not very sure of this, but as of now, that's what I think about this point that you are trying to make. Yeah.
Sir, I have a question. আমার নিজের একটা কোয়েশ্চেন রয়েছে, আমি করব?
হ্যাঁ
আচ্ছা, তো আপনি প্রথমে বললেন চর্যাপদের কথা, and Manohar Mouli বিশ্বাস interpretation of চর্যাপদ, and we know that there was a dearth of Dalit literature in Bengal, and there is always this complaint against Bengal literature. It took so late, it was very late for the Bengali Dalit writers to emerge. কিন্তু এদিকে আমরা দেখছি যে the earliest texts like চর্যাপদ বা মধ্যযুগের যে বইগুলো, সেইগুলোতে they can be interpreted under a Dalit lens.
Right.
In the same line of thought, আমরা যদি পাঞ্জাবি দলিত লিটারেচারকে দেখি, যেটা মনোহর মৌলি বিশ্বাস ওনার দলিত সাহিত্যের রূপরেখাতে লিখেছেন, এবং আমি এটা একটু পড়ে শোনাচ্ছি। ওটা আমি একটু পড়ে শোনাচ্ছি। সেটা হচ্ছে পশ্চিম ভারতের ভক্তি আন্দোলন, বিশেষ করে সুফি কবি শেখ ফরিদ, বল্লে শাহ, ধন্না ও কবিরের প্রভাব, গুরু নানক ও অন্যান্য শিখ গুরুদের অবদান, এবং আধুনিক কালে এসে ভগৎ সিং এর আন্দোলন ধর্মভেদের আর বর্ণভেদের কুপ্রভাব থেকে পাঞ্জাবি সমাজকে মুক্ত হতে সাহায্য করেছে। বানিয়ার কথনে সমৃদ্ধ শিখ আদিগ্রন্থ ভারতীয় জাতি বা বর্ণ বিভাজিত সমাজের শোষণ, অত্যাচার ও ঘৃণার বিরুদ্ধে সমর্থ প্রথম ধর্মীয় প্রচার। সকল শিখ গুরু এবং তাদের ভক্তেরা ছিলেন অ্যান্টি কাস্টিস্ট। সেদিক থেকে বিচার করে আদি গ্রন্থ পাঞ্জাবের দলিত সাহিত্যের মূল তত্ত্ব সূচিত করেছে, আর সে কাজ শুরু হয়েছিল কয়েকশো বছর আগে থেকেই। সো ইন দ্য সেম লাইন অফ থট আমরা দেখলাম যে আমাদের বাংলাতেও আর্লিস্ট টেক্সট যেটা চর্যাপদ রয়েছে, বা সেগুলোতেও কিন্তু এই অ্যান্টি কাস্টিস্ট স্ট্যান্স রয়েছে। তো now if any literary text have anti-casteist stance, can we call it Dalit literature? Anti-casteist থাকলে কি তাকে Dalit literature বলা যায়? Secondly, আপনি যেমন এই কথাটা এর ব্যাপারে বললেন, অদ্বৈত মল্ল বর্মনের তিতাস একটি নদীর নামের জন্য বললেন যে it has lost its relevance, or rather say it does not carry the same amount of relevance as the 1990s books, the recent books on Dalit literature carries. So at this point of time, how should Dalit scholar approach the earliest texts?
না, শুডের উত্তর আমি দিতে পারবো না, কিন্তু তুমি বোধহয় আমার বক্তব্যগুলো একটু মিসকোট করছো বা কোথাও একটা কমিউনিকেটেড হয়নি খুব প্রপারলি। প্রথম যেটা পয়েন্টটা বললে সেটাতে আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছি সেটা হলো যে আমি আই উড রাদার এগ্রি উইথ ইউ। আমার কাছে আমার মনে হয় না যে সেগুলোকে টিপিক্যালি কোট আনকোট দলিত সাহিত্যের, বাংলা দলিত সাহিত্যের টেক্সট বলা যায় বলে। তার কারণ একটাই, তার কারণটা হচ্ছে বাংলা দলিত সাহিত্য বলতে যেটা আমরা 90-এর দশকে পাচ্ছি সেটার একটা পার্টিকুলারিটি আছে, সেটার একটা বিশেষত্ব আছে। সেই বিশেষত্বটা হচ্ছে তার একটা জ্যোতিবা ফুলে, আম্বেদকর, দলিত প্যান্থার তার দ্বারা অনুপ্রাণিত। তুমি দলিত সাহিত্যের রূপরেখা থেকে কোট করলে, তুমি দলিত সাহিত্যের দিক বলয় দেখো, তুমি দলিত সাহিত্যের রূপরেখা দেখো, দলিত সাহিত্যের ইতিহাস যতীনবালার বই সেটা দেখো, প্রত্যেকটা টেক্সট কিন্তু ওপেন করছে কানাডা দলিত সাহিত্য, মারাঠি দলিত সাহিত্য, গুজরাটি দলিত সাহিত্য, তামিল দলিত সাহিত্য, সেগুলোর কথা বলে তারপর বাংলায় ঢুকছে। এটা আসলে রিফ্লেক্ট করছে যেভাবে আমরা বাংলা দলিত সাহিত্যটাকে ক্রোনোলজিক্যালি আমাদের ডোমেনে, আমাদের ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গলের যে কালচারাল স্পেসে যেভাবে পেয়েছি। তার মানে কি আগের জেনারেশনে কোথাও কোনো সোশ্যাল রিফর্মিস্ট এনথুজিয়াজম ছিল না? ইয়াং বেঙ্গল মুভমেন্ট নিয়ে মনোহরবাবু দলিত সাহিত্যের রূপরেখাতে কথা বলছেন, উনি এর কথা বলছেন, আমাদের হাংরিয়ালিস্ট মুভমেন্টের কথা বলছেন বাংলা সাহিত্যে। ফলে হি ইজ অলসো টকিং অ্যাবাউট আদার থিংস ইন দ্যাট বুক। কিন্তু সেখানে উনি বলছেন যে সোশ্যাল রিফর্মিস্ট জিলটা কোথাও খুব কাস্টকে যে একেবারে সেন্টার স্টেজে এনে নিয়ে এসেছে, সেটা রেনেসার সময়, সো কল রেনেসার সময় যে হয়েছে তা নয়, আর পরবর্তীকালেও যে কল্লোল কালিকলম ইরাতে হয়েছে বা হাংরিয়ালিস্ট মুভমেন্টের সময় হয়েছে, সেই সময় যে খুব ভালোভাবে সেটা হয়েছে তা হয়নি। কিন্তু আর আরেকটা জিনিস হচ্ছে যে মানে অনেক প্রাচীন যে প্রি মডার্ন যে টেক্সট গুলো, চর্যাগীতি এটসেট্রার কথা আমরা বলছি, আমরা ভূসুকপাত, পুকুরিপাত, শবরীপাদের কথা বলছি, সেগুলোতে হয়তো একটা অ্যান্টি কাস্ট সেন্টিমেন্ট আমরা কোথাও কোথাও পাচ্ছি, কিন্তু সেটা খুব স্ক্যাটার্ড ভাবে, এবং সেটার মধ্যে কোথাও কিন্তু ওই আম্বেদকরাইট অ্যান্টি কাস্ট আইডিওলজিটা খুব প্রমিনেন্টলি নেই, থাকার কথাই তো নয়, তখন তো ওটা ছিলই না। মানে দেবযানী গাঙ্গুলির একটা খুব বিখ্যাত বই আছে দলিত লাইফ ওয়ার্ল্ডস এর উপরে, সেই বইটাতে দেখবে গাঙ্গুলি ইজ মেকিং এ ভেরি ইন্টারেস্টিং পয়েন্ট by deriving some insights from Michel Foucault's essay What is an Author। হ্যাঁ, ফুকো যেভাবে মার্কসকে বলেছেন ইনিশিয়েটর অফ দ্য মার্কসিস্ট ডিসকোর্স, ফ্রয়েড যেভাবে ইনিশিয়েটস সাইকোঅ্যানালিটিক্যাল ডিসকোর্স, আম্বেদকর সিমিলারলি ইনিশিয়েটস দ্য অ্যান্টিকাস্ট দলিত ডিসকোর্স। এই যদি হয় ব্যাপারটা, তাহলে, এবং এটা তো এই ক্লেমটা তো শুধু দেবযানী গাঙ্গুলি পয়েন্ট আউট করে দিচ্ছেন তা না, এটা দলিত সাহিত্যকাররা, দলিত অ্যাক্টিভিস্টরা নিজেরাই বলছেন। মনোহরবাবুর বইতেও তুমি তাই পাবে, যতীনবালার বইতেও তুমি তাই পাবে, মারাঠি লেখকদের বইতেও এরকমই পাবে, যে একটা আম্বেদকরাইট অ্যান্টিকাস্ট রেটরিকের দ্বারা এটা অনুপ্রাণিত হয়ে তৈরি হচ্ছে। সুতরাং সেই ডেভেলপমেন্টের কিছু স্পেসিফিক ক্যারেক্টারিস্টিক আছে, হ্যাঁ, ডিসকার্সিভ আইডিওলজিক্যাল কিছু স্পেসিফিক ক্যারেক্টারিস্টিক আছে। সেইটা আর অদ্বৈত মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সটটাকে আমি ফেলনা বলিনি বা লেস রেলিভেন্ট বলিনি। আমি বলতে চাইছি অদ্বৈত মল্লবর্মণের তিতাসেচি নদীর নামের নিজস্ব অ্যান্টিকাস্ট ইথস থাকতে পারে, সেই এক্সটেন্ট অবধি এটা খুব কেয়ারফুলি ডিসার্ন করতে হবে, যে বা ডিস্টিংগুইশ করতে হবে, যে সেই এক্সটেন্ট অবধি হয়তো আমরা ওটাকে এক ধরনের দলিত সাহিত্য বলবো, কিন্তু সেটাকে টিপিক্যালি দলিত সাহিত্য বলবো না, যেটা কিনা 1990s পাচ্ছি ইন দ্য রাইটিংস অফ মনোহর মৌলী বিশ্বাস, ইন দ্য রাইটিংস অফ মনোরঞ্জন ব্যাপারী, কল্যাণী ঠাকুর, মঞ্জু বালা, কপিল কৃষ্ণ ঠাকুর, যতীন বালা, নকুল মল্লিক, এদের লেখাতে যেটা পাচ্ছি। এইটা কিন্তু আমাদেরকে একটু ডিস্টিংগুইশ করতে হবে। তার মানে কি অদ্বৈত মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সটটাকে রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি দলিত সাহিত্য টেক্সট হিসেবে দেখা যায় না একেবারেই? তা হয়তো নয়, তার কারণ তার নিজস্ব কিছু ইকুয়েশনস আছে তার ন্যারেটিভের মধ্যে, যেগুলো আর ইম্পর্টেন্ট টু আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড দ্য কাস্ট কোয়েশ্চেন ইন বেঙ্গল, and also the possibility of some anti-caste ethos, if that is there at all, সেটা আমরা খুঁজে পেতে চেষ্টা করতে পারি। গৌতম ভদ্রের একটা বিখ্যাত লেখা আছে, মনোহরবাবু আজকে বোধহয় অডিয়েন্সে আছেন, মনোহরবাবু বলবেন আরো।
উনি চলে গেলেন।
আচ্ছা, উনি চলে গেলেন। তো ওখানে দেখবে গৌতম ভদ্রের একটা প্রবন্ধ আছে, যেটা অদ্বৈত মল্লবর্মণের উপর একটা বিশেষ সংখ্যা বা একটা অ্যান্থোলজি অফ ক্রিটিক্যাল এসেস, সেখানে মনোহরবাবু নিজের লেখাও আছে। সেখানে গৌতম বাবু বলছেন যে কিভাবে অদ্বৈত মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সটটা দুটো ফর্মে আমরা পাচ্ছি, একটা ঋত্বিক ঘটকের অ্যাডাপ্টেশন, আর একটা হচ্ছে মল্লবর্মণের নিজের টেক্সটটা, এবং সেগুলো দলিতের চোখে কিরকম আর মধ্যবিত্তের চোখে, মানে ভদ্রলোকের চোখে বলতে চাইছেন রাফলি, সেই দুটো কিভাবে আলাদা। হ্যাঁ, গৌতম ভদ্র এইটাকে আলোচনা করছেন। সুতরাং এই আলোচনাগুলোর পসিবিলিটি তো অদ্বৈত মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সটটা দিচ্ছে, এই আলোচনাগুলোর পসিবিলিটি তো মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সটটা দিচ্ছে না এমন নয়। মল্লবর্মণের অন্য আরো অনেকগুলো টেক্সট আছে, ছোট গল্প কিছু কিছু আছে, স্পর্শ দোষের মতো গল্প আছে, অ্যাপারেন্টলি কাস্টের কথা বলছে না কিন্তু কাস্টের কথাই আছে সেখানে। ডেপ্রিভেশনের গল্প আছে, মার্জিনালাইজেশনের গল্প আছে, নেই তো তা নয়, কিন্তু সেটার মধ্যে যে এই যে ডিসকোর্সটার একটা ক্লেম, এই যে ক্যানন ফরমেশনের যে ক্লেম, সেটা কি তখন ছিল? এখন যদি আমি মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সটটাকে দলিত সাহিত্যের টেক্সট হিসেবে ধরতে হয়, তাহলে দ্যাট ক্যান অনলি বি আ রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভ কনসেপচুয়ালাইজেশন অফ দ্যাট টেক্সট অ্যাজ এ দলিত টেক্সট। রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি ভাবছি,
আপনি
রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি ভাবছি।
ক্যাননের কথাটা বললেন, এটা একটু elaborate করবেন? ক্যানন ফরমেশনের কথাটা বললেন আপনি, অদ্বৈত বললেন ক্যানন ফরমেশনের কথা বললেন।
হ্যাঁ, আমি ক্যানন ফরমেশন বলছি যে এই যে একটা, এটা তো একটা লিটারারি ক্যানন তৈরি হচ্ছে, একটা একটা আমরা এটাকে ক্যানন বলি, হ্যাঁ, যে একটা মানে সাহিত্যের একটা একটা ধারা, এই যে সাহিত্যের ধারাটা তৈরি হচ্ছে তার যে বিশিষ্ট নেচারটা, তার যে কতগুলো বিশেষত্ব আর কি, সেটা দিয়েই তো আমি ডিস্টিংগুইশ করব ফ্রম আদার ধারা অফ লিটারেচার, আদার ট্র্যাডিশনস, আদার ডোমেইনস অফ লিটারেচার। সেই ডিফারেন্সের আর্টিকুলেশনটা is depended on that question of A, lived experience, B, আম্বেদকারাইট আইডিওলজি এটসেট্রা। সেইগুলো লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্স হয়তো ছিল, কিন্তু আম্বেদকারাইট আইডিওলজির যে ইমপ্রিন্ট সেটা তো মল্লবর্মণে বা চর্যাগীতিতে ছিল না রে বাবা, থাকার সম্ভবই না। মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সট তো 1950s এর টেক্সট, তখন অবধি মারাঠি দলিত প্যান্থার ম্যানিফেস্টো আসেনি 1970s এ। ক্রোনোলজিক্যালি ইটস ইম্পসিবল। তার মানে কি এই তারা কোনোদিন কোনো রকম ভাবে তাদের মধ্যে কাস্ট চেতনা ছিল না, অ্যান্টি কাস্ট চেতনা ছিল না? ছিল, কিন্তু সেটাকে কি দলিত সাহিত্যের টেক্সট বলে খুব শিওরলি বলা যায়? আমার ধারণা যায় না। বললেও এই ক্যাভিয়েট দিয়ে বলতে হবে যে এটা রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি ভাবা বাবা, যেটা রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি ভাবছে। এবার এই রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি যে ভাবছে এই কথাটা কিন্তু দলিত সাহিত্যকারদের যে অ্যাপারেন্ট ক্লেম তার মধ্যে নেই। অ্যাজ এ রিসার্চার আমরা দেখছি যেটা রেট্রোস্পেক্টিভলি তৈরি, যে ফিরে গিয়ে দেখছি আমি, হ্যাঁ, এই যে ফিরে দেখা, মল্লবর্মণকে, বিনয় মজুমদারকে ফিরে দেখে আমি বলছি ওরাও দলিত সাহিত্যের কথা বলছে, ওদেরকেও দলিত মানুষ বলা যায়, তাদের সাহিত্যকেও কোনোভাবে একটা দলিত সাহিত্য ভাবা যায়, নিশ্চয়ই যায়। কিন্তু যে ধরনের টেক্সট, যেমন ধরো মতুয়া সাহিত্য, মতুয়া সাহিত্য কি দলিত সাহিত্য নয়? নিশ্চয়ই এক অর্থে দলিত সাহিত্য। দলিত মানুষের তৈরি, লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্স বেসড, কাস্টের কথা বলছে, অ্যান্টি কাস্ট চেতনা আছে, এরকম একটা সাহিত্য। কিন্তু সেটা কি পুরোপুরি আম্বেদকারাইট? আমরা যারা রিসার্চ করি, মতুয়াদের নিয়ে কাজ করেছি, মতুয়া ন্যারেটিভ নিয়ে কাজ করেছি, আমরা জানি যে সেটা পুরোটা সত্য নয়। পুরোটা যদি সত্য হতো তাহলে মতুয়াদের যে পলিটিক্সটা এখন আমরা দেখতে পাই সেটা হতো না সেইভাবে আর কি, বা হলেও সেটা অনেকটা বেশি হয়তো কন্টেন্ট হওয়ার জায়গা থাকতো ফ্রম এন আম্বেদকারাইট পলিটিক্যাল পার্সপেক্টিভ। সেটা হয়নি। আর অন্যান্য অনেক হিস্টোরিক্যাল রিজনস আছে, পার্টিশন ইত্যাদি, পোস্ট পার্টিশন মুসলিম মতুয়া রিলেশনশিপ, সেগুলো তো আমি যাচ্ছি না, কিন্তু বাই অ্যান্ড লার্জ তো এরকমই ব্যাপারটা। ফলে আমি ওটা বলিনি যে মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সট লেস রেলিভেন্ট, বরং আমি বলবো মল্লবর্মণের টেক্সট ইজ ভেরি রেলিভেন্ট ফর আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং দ্য ওয়ে দিস পলিটিক্স অফ ক্যানন ফরমেশন vis-a-vis বাংলা দলিত সাহিত্য হ্যাজ আনফোল্ডেড ফ্রম 1990s। এই যে বিশ্বাস ব্যাপারী বা বালাদের যে বা কল্যাণীদিদের যে আর্টিকুলেশনস গুলো, সেগুলোকে আমরা বোঝবার জন্যে আমাদের মাঝে মাঝে মল্লবর্মণটাও পড়তে হবে। সুতরাং মল্লবর্মণ ইজ ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট, একবারও বলছি না সেটা। আর তুমি যেটা প্রথমে বললে যে চর্যাগীতি এগুলোকে কি বলা যায়, আমি বলছি তো যে এগুলোকে পরিষ্কার ভাবে ওরকম দলিত সাহিত্যের টেক্সট বলে ধরা যাবেই না, কখনোই নয়। তাহলে কি শতবর্ষের দলিত সাহিত্যে বিশ্বাস আর শ্যামল প্রামাণিক ভুল কথা বলছেন? তাও নয়। আসলে আমাদের না এই ইদার অর ব্যাপারগুলো একটু ছেড়ে দিতে হবে, যে এটা হলে ওটা নয়, ওটা হলে এটা নয়। হ্যাঁ, দুটোই কেন নয়, মানে বুঝতে পারছো? এটা এইভাবে যদি আমরা দেখি তাহলে বোধহয় সুবিধে হয় আর কি। হ্যাঁ, শতবর্ষের দলিত সাহিত্য নিশ্চয়ই। আবার শতবর্ষের দলিত সাহিত্য বলেই আমি বলবো যে দলিত সাহিত্যের যে এই দলিত সাহিত্য বলে পরিচিতি নিজেকে দেওয়া, সেটা কিন্তু 90s এর দশকে, 90-এর দশকে আমরা পাচ্ছি। এই দুটোকেই আমরা মেনে চলতে হবে আর কি। এইটাই আমার পার্সপেক্টিভ।
ঠিক আছে, Anyone, any more question? Or you should conclude it
I
here?
think we are running out of time. I have
Yes,
to
yes, yes. Yes.
Uh,
Okay, so I would like to express gratitude to Professor Das for responding to our invitation, for making this evening so rich. And in coming days, we look forward to have you with us. Also, উনি যেটা বললেন যে you can watch our previous playlist. I would encourage others to do the same. In previous lectures, we were not so fortunate to have so many audience. So, but nonetheless, I mean, all the lectures that was conducted was very rich in terms of their content. So I would urge others, if you can spare some time, to go back to them. Thanks to the viewers for attending the session and coming up with excellent observation. With this note, I conclude this session. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again, and thank you, everyone.